Good evening, everybody, and it's lovely to be back in my group tonight towards the end of May 2023. Now, this week happens to be Type 2 Diabetes Prevention Week, and there's a lot of emphasis around diabetes these days because almost 10% of the population have either been diagnosed with diabetes or are at risk of type 2 diabetes. I want to talk a little bit about what type 2 diabetes is, but really to emphasize that this is a lifestyle disease. We can modify our diet, we can also modify our lifestyle, and collectively together with those things and exercise can have a dramatic difference on the risk factor, if you like, of going on to develop type diabetes. The numbers that have been diagnosed with diabetes since the 1980s around the world collectively have quadrupled. And we know without any doubt, and I can certainly see this, that our lifestyles and our dietary choices are significantly different over the last 40, 50, going back into the 70s, 60 years. It is no surprise to me that diabetes is rocketing off the scale. And we mustn't forget that this is a serious condition. At its absolute worst extreme situation, it can be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, for strokes, for sight loss, even for amputations. You know, it is serious. We must take it seriously. It is worth getting checked out. And this week on Diabetes UK, I think that's the correct website, there is a risk calculator you can use. I quickly did it. It's a very, very basic tool based on your age, your waist circumference, your ethnicity, because Asian backgrounds have a higher risk than, for example, white backgrounds, whether you're male, female, your age. But they do not ask a single question about your lifestyle and your dietary choices. It's a massive gap because it will significantly affect your risk of developing it. Because I'm 57, although I had no other factors raised in the very simplistic test that it asked, it suggested that my risk of going on to develop diabetes was 10%. And maybe it is if I didn't look after my diet, but I do look after my diet. So I actually think my risk is very, very minimal. I think I'd have to do something very drastically different in the way I eat. Not only is it a serious health condition, but we know it's a massive impact on the NHS budget. If you're in the UK, it takes 10% of the NHS budget when we know things are extremely stretched. So for all sorts of reasons, whether it's for our own health and well-being or whether we really want to protect our precious NHS, then there's even more reason to think about how we can take some action. So diabetes type 2, what is it? It is when glucose sugar levels in the bloodstream starts to get too high. And there are two reasons why this happens. Either the pancreas is no longer secreting sufficient insulin to respond to the amount of glucose that's in the bloodstream, because it's insulin that takes glucose to our cells. It sort of knocks on the doors of the cells and asks the cells to take the glucose that it will be able to use if it needs it. It may not need the amount that's being produced, and that's where the problem starts. If it needs it to produce energy, it is one of our sources of energy. It is not our only source, but parts of the body like the brain do need glucose for energy. So it's important that we have glucose, but if there's not enough insulin being produced anymore from the pancreas, then the glucose levels in the blood can stay too high. And the second reason is that the cells no longer respond sufficiently to the request by insulin to take the glucose into the bloodstream, because in my view, the way I look at it is that they get fed up of constantly being asked by insulin when it's knocking on the doors of the cells to say, can you take more glucose, please? And they go, just do not need it. They sort of give up. They don't react anymore to the request by insulin. It's what we call insulin resistance. Insulin resistance starts to be one of the first lines before you may then go on to be diagnosed with diabetes. And the test that is used by the NHS is the HbA1c, which is looking at glycated hemoglobin, when sugar gets attached to red blood cells, and the greater the quantity that builds up over a period of time, is showing that there's a lot of glucose that is stuck in the bloodstream and not able to be taken elsewhere. So, of course, what can we do about it? This is why you've tuned in to watch this. What are the 5 food groups that I think we need to be very cautious of and to eat in moderation, possibly even avoid some of these foods? If this is all to do with foods that create a lot of sugar. So the temptation is to think, well, I've cut down on the sweets, the biscuits, the chocolate, the cake, that's all you need to do. But you need to think much broader than this. And in my view, some of the information that comes from the NHS Eat Well plate does not go far enough in enabling people to really take control of their blood glucose levels and help to lower their risk of going on to develop type 2 diabetes. So all of these food groups can, if they're not balanced and they're eating in excess, to raise our glucose, our sugar levels in the bloodstream too high, which then can go on to create the long-term problem that can become type 2 diabetes. So first of all, have a look at your consumption of starchy grains. We're thinking here about things like wheat and oats and barley. There are other grains as well. Of course, wheat is one of the ones that we eat in high amounts, also rice as well, because these are starchy grains, and starches are, when we think about it, sugars. They are sugar molecules that quickly get broken down in the bloodstream to simple sugars and taken up into the bloodstream. So watch your intake of grains and be very, very careful and avoid as much as possible the refined white grains. Any white-based products, white rice, white bread, white crackers, white pasta, they are so starchy and so sugary. Think twice before you eat those. There is no fiber in them, and fiber slows the speed that this glucose is taken from these grains and into the bloodstream. You get more of a drip feed effect, which is what we want to happen. So avoid the white grains as much as possible. And the other grains, then think about having one portion, small portion a day, but don't eat them at every meal. Review what you're eating and cut down. The second one is continuing the theme about grains, but about wheat-based products. Here I'm talking about pizzas, pies, pastry, of course, things like bread, cakes and biscuits, pita breads, crumpets, crackers. We tend to be a nation, or the Western world, where we eat a massive consumption of wheat-based products, and it follows on from what I just said. And most of these wheat-based products tend to be the refined varieties. How often do you see a whole grain pizza base, for example? And if you are eating pizza, you're going for the really skinny thin ones, or you're going for the deep pan thick ones? You know, be very, very careful. When we tend to eat these types of foods, not only are we consuming a lot of starchy grain, but we're lacking a lot of protein and fats to go with them. Unless you're buying or making a really high quality pie, for example, you're going to find that there's a lot of pastry and very little protein-based filling to balance it out, again, to slow the speed that sugars are released from these grains from the wheat. So be really careful of eating foods like that, and never think you can eat a pie alongside potatoes, because you're getting a double whammy of all those starchy foods. And I'm going to come on to talk about starchy vegetables right now. So the third food group here is thinking about starchy vegetables, thinking about the starchy root vegetables. The word starchy, again, describes the fact that these products are very high in sugars. Sugars get released from these products quickly. There's a lot of the sugars. We don't want so much sugar going into the bloodstream. And of course, I'm talking here about potatoes. White and sweet potatoes are starchy. We're talking about parsnips, swede, turnips, beetroot. We're also thinking about squashes, butternut squash, and sweet corn. There are a few other starchy vegetables, but these predominantly are the main ones. a lot of starch and a lot of sugar. Now, of course, some of these are better than others. Some of them are quite highly nutritious from a vitamin, mineral, plant compounds perspective. So beetroot, I'm a fan of, butternut squash, sweet potato, really nutritious. And I'm not saying exclude those from your diet. Have those foods in your diet in moderation, but be very careful about the quantities that you eat, and never think about eating, for example, beetroot again with potatoes or with pasta or with rice. They are starchy. Have it as an either or situation. The fourth group that I want to talk about are cereals. It's again the last sort of 50 odd years, we get shelves and shelves and rows in supermarkets that are stacked high with different types of boxed cereals. Most of them are refined. They're way too high in sugars. They don't really have a place in a healthy breakfast, for example. Going back to the 50s and go to work on an egg campaign is a much healthier choice. And I do recognize that you may not want to be getting up in the morning and cooking eggs if you want something quick. If you want something more of a cereal based, then your porridge oats, which are a complex grain, are going to be a better choice for you. But do watch all those cereals. You've only got to look at the back of the packet and look at the carbohydrate content, together with the amount of sugars in those products, that you start to realize how careful you need to be when you're looking at them. Be careful of the marketing hype, which talks about the added vitamins, the B vitamins, the vitamin D, possibly the iodine that may have been added to these things, or the amount of fiber. Look at the packet, look at the carbohydrates, look at the sugars, and choose very, very carefully when you have those, or avoid them altogether. And my final group of products here is thinking about fruits. Now, we think about fruits as being healthy. It's a plant food. We think about it as one of our 5 a day, although, as I frequently say to my followers and my clients, we should be thinking more about 10 a day, but those should predominantly come from our vegetables. Fruits tend to be high in sugars, and some are much worse than others. The ones that are the worst and more sugary are your tropical fruits, the mangoes, the pineapple. Then we've got things like grapes and bananas. A lot of sugar in those foods. Be very, very careful and don't eat them very often. Be mindful, small portions, and keep them for a special occasion, and don't eat them every day. And then when we think beyond just the actual natural fruit, be really careful of dried fruits. They are a condensed form of sugar. They're marketed as being a healthy choice. I know they contain vitamins, minerals. I know they contain fiber, but there's a lot of sugar in dried fruit, whether it's raisins, sultanas, dried mango, dried apricots, dried bananas. Be very, very careful. They are delivering a lot of sugar into your bloodstream very, very quickly. And be careful, therefore, if you are choosing a granola or a muesli. They're often marketed as being really healthy choices, but you've got the double whammy of the starchy grains alongside the condensed sugars in the dried fruit. So be really careful when you're choosing those. You can get some low sugar options now. They've often got additional nuts and seeds, and they take out the dried fruit and the honey. Another thing to be careful of. And just finally, thinking about your fruit juices, again, you really shouldn't consume fruit juice. You're just getting a massive hit of sugar into your bloodstream that's not helpful. So don't consume fruit juice. It doesn't really have a place in our diet. If you like a bit of fruit alongside vegetables in a smoothie, make sure you add that protein powder that I talk so much about. So those are my top 5 food groups to be very wary of if you want to be careful, thinking long term about helping to protect yourself from the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And I'm recording this at the end of May 23, when it's the type 2 diabetes prevention week. So you're able to take action to really help prevent the development of this. Hope you found that useful. If you're watching it live, thank you for watching, or watching it on catch up in my Facebook group. If you're watching this on my YouTube channel, Peyton Principles Natural Health, please subscribe so that you get notified of my future lives that I do. And come and join my Facebook group, Inspired Lifestyle Choices for Women over 35. Men are most welcome too, so that you keep up to date on all the lives that I deliver almost every single Tuesday. Thank you for watching. Have a great week, everybody. Bye.